Last week we noted that in our lectionary gospel readings from Luke, they are paralleled by very much similar teachings in the Gospel of Matthew. And in Matthew's gospel, which is maybe more familiar to more people, the teachings are taking place when Jesus goes up to a high spot, and it's often called the Sermon on the Mount. And in Luke, the similar teachings are offered on the plain, in the valley. As we noted last week, a reminder that the life of Jesus is not just mountaintop experiences, not just for lofty places, but to be lived out in the valleys of everyday life. Also, in Matthew's gospel, a number of the teachings are introduced with this phrase, "You have heard it said, but I say unto you." You have heard it said, but I say unto you. This was a typical rabbinical teaching style where a rabbi would describe something that was conventional wisdom. It's a bit of what we've been doing actually in the Learning at 11 the last 3 weeks. What are the stories we hear? What's the conventional wisdom? And then he'd say, "But I say to you," and it would often turn the conventional wisdom on its head. So in the kind of prelude to the same teaching we heard in Luke's gospel, in Matthew's gospel he says, "You have heard it said unto you, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." And I imagine lots of people are like, check. That's easy. But he says, "But I say unto you, love your enemy and pray for those who create difficulty for you, who persecute you." And I will tell you, I've heard these teachings all my life, and for a lot of my life, I thought in some way they did not apply. And one reason is I like to think of myself as someone who does not hate. Well, I don't hate people. I want to be kind and compassionate and loving. And sure, sometimes people at a distance who I didn't really know, I might say, "I hate that person," or "I can't stand that person." But people in my real life, I didn't think of myself as a hater. And through a lot of my life, I didn't think of myself as having enemies. Oh, there were the bullies here and there, including people sometimes on a church council. But I did not experience a sustained way that I think of as an enemy. And so I would think, interesting teaching, Jesus, but I'm already covered. And then I had an experience some years ago where someone who I thought of as a friend had betrayed me and turned on me. And this person then tried to kind of cut me out of life. It was hard because we lived in the same community and we'd run into each other in some of the same places. And I'd never had an experience like that in my adult life. What I would say to people, and I still would, is I have been blessed to know some of the best human beings, people in family and in life and in friendship. And so I just didn't have much experience of people doing that kind of thing to me. And so at first I was disoriented, and I was hurt, and I was sad, and sometimes angry. But then I thought, well, all right, I'll let it go. But then I found myself paying too much attention to this person. You ever done that? And the person, for example, I still saw their social media, and they'd post these posts about how important it was to be compassionate and kind. And I would look at my screen and say, "Hypocrite!" Or then I also found myself in places where the person I knew, because we're in, again, the same community, engaging in some certain endeavors, and I found myself wanting them to fail. And I found myself wanting this person to be exposed for the hypocrisy and their real self. I was paying way too much time and energy to that. But I didn't see it as hate yet. But then there was this time in morning prayer, and I want to offer this, that I think one of the great gifts of prayer that includes prayer that has silence and listening is that prayer brings self-awareness. God-awareness and self-awareness. And in this time of prayer, I had this thought about this person. I wasn't praying for him, I'll tell you. And I felt this surging anger, and then I realized I hate this person. And then I hated that I hated, because it's not how I saw myself. And I didn't want all those tough teachings to apply to me. And it wasn't immediate, but then I realized there was a gift in that self-awareness, because I recognized that on my own, left to my own devices, I am perfectly capable of drifting from hurt to hate and having the capacity to hate and wish harm upon people, which meant that I needed some help. I needed God. I needed other people. That left to my own devices, I can hate and I can do damage and harm. And so I need deeper wisdom and higher power. And that was a gift. We see how this works on some level in the story from Genesis that we just heard a little bit. It's actually a novella in Genesis. It's one of the longest stories in all of the Bible, following the arc of Jacob's sons and this character Joseph. So just try to do a short recap a little bit to understand the context of what we have at the end that John read to us. So Joseph is number 11 of 12 sons. And in his time and place, in the patriarchal culture, the eldest get all the good stuff. Sometimes in our culture it still happens. But they would have the inheritance and the power and all of that. So, boy, you're number 11, you're getting nothing. And your life is kind of like, eh. So, and he's not even the baby of the family, that'll be Benjamin. In his time and place, he is expected to not amount to much or do much. But Dad, Jacob, favors Joseph. And there's complex reasons for this. We won't go into all of it now, because we just have to spend the whole time redoing the Joseph story. But Dad favors Joseph and gives him, in the language of Andrew Lloyd Webber, a Technicolor dream coat. An amazing Technicolor dream coat, but a fancy, expensive garment. And Joseph, even as he's with his family, he's listening for how is God still speaking, and there's dreams, and he shares them. And in all of this, his brothers, they can see that something successful might happen with Joseph, and instead of celebrating that, instead of cheering on their baby brother, they're resentful. And the resentment, they nurture this garden of grievances, and the resentment becomes hatred, and the fruit of hatred is often damage and violence, which is one of the reasons Jesus is so clear about it's not a good place to stay in hatred. And sure enough, these brothers, these older brothers, there's this time Joseph is calling them in from the fields, and they say, let's kill him. Your brother. I mean, sometimes you might say, I want to kill him, but we don't actually make a plan, most of us. And they did. They stripped his cloak off of him, and it's not even a merciful way of doing it. They throw him in a pit where he would die slowly from dehydration and exposure to the elements. It's torturous. This is what hate does. Is it creates violence and cruelty and even torture. So then some slave traders are coming by, and the brothers come up with a plan B. One of them might have had a hint of compassion. It's hard to know. But it seems for most of the brothers, there's going to be a 2-for-1. Because they could sell their brother into slavery and get rid of him and make some money. And that's what they choose to do. So, done with Joseph, sold into slavery, we'll tell Dad a story that he's dead. So Joseph has lots of reason to hate those brothers, don't you think? And we don't, in the story, we're not told about the emotional life of Joseph in that point in time. We don't know what he's feeling. But what we see throughout the story is that Joseph, to the best of his ability, keeps paying attention to God. And one of the ways Joseph hears God still speaking is through his dreams. And so he shares what comes. And we see that Joseph, enslaved in a household, actually rises up to become head of the household servants. Then he gets betrayed by an abusive woman. And then he gets thrown in jail. But he keeps paying attention to God, listening in dreams. How is God still speaking? And he becomes essentially like the head of the prisoners' guild. And again, long story short, eventually he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. And Pharaoh, in the telling of the story, is the most powerful person in the ancient world. And Joseph is there. And one of the reasons Joseph is there is he's helping Pharaoh understand climate catastrophe and how to prepare and help the people deal with that they're in an unreliable climate. And there's going to be, for example, drought, which will mean famine and starvation. So, because borders are often arbitrary, it doesn't just affect Egypt. It affects the whole Mediterranean basin, including where Joseph's family of origin lives in the land of Canaan. And so they're affected by the drought, they're affected by the famine, and like many people, their lives are at risk, and that causes them to leave their home and cross the border to another place. And you know what? No one arrested them and sent them back. They were allowed to come into Egypt because Egypt had greater resources and could be of help. That's how it worked in the story. So they come into Egypt. Now they are in line, and Joseph sees them. And Joseph knows it's them. They don't know it's Joseph. It's a bit like in our Bible study on Tuesday, we're in the resurrection in John's gospel, and people don't recognize Jesus. Why don't they recognize Jesus? Because they're not expecting him to be there, resurrected. So the brothers don't recognize Joseph. They are not expecting maybe him to be alive, let alone, right? What did they do last? Sold him into slavery. They're not expecting him to be Pharaoh's right-hand man, administering the empire. So, a reminder that Joseph is not perfect, even though he's been paying attention to God. And again, shortening this long story, he messes with his brothers. He does not immediately make everything all right. But what happens in the story is, and then we get to the place today, he, though, forgives his brothers. He ultimately forgives his brothers, and not just forgives them. It's not a forgive and forget. He actually engages his brothers with compassion, with mercy, and helps them have what they need to live. Now, some of us, we might have grown up hearing this story, and maybe as a kid you don't quite notice it as we might as adults. But if we really listen to the story, we might be feeling annoyed. How could he forgive them? How could he love them? They tried to kill him. They sold him into slavery. I mean, on my list of things to hold grudges against people, those would be high. How does he do it? How are such things possible? So that brings us back to Jesus. And Jesus, he talks about loving your enemy. Now, anyone else hear that in their life, that Jesus teaches us to love your enemy? This is a poll. Oh, just a couple of you? Right. I know most of you have heard it. So we've heard it, but I don't know. I know a lot of times I heard it, but then how do you do it? Right? I mean, I could sit here and just like keep raising, love your enemy, love your enemy, love your enemy. Are you going to be able to do it because I just said it to you louder and louder or over and over again? I mean, it might start to sink in that it matters. But a lot of times the teachings of Jesus are treated somehow like a rule book and just go do it. And then people often feel like, I don't know how to do it. And then they say, well, it's just aspirational and he doesn't really mean to do it and da-da-da-da-da. Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew makes that direct connection. We also see it here in Luke. He tells you how to love your enemy. Pray for them. Pray for them. Love your enemy and pray for those who would do you harm. And we need to unpack that a little bit, because also I think it's not pray against them, which is easier to do. Oh, Lord, help them to fail, right? Pray for them. Pray for them. And this is praying for what? All kinds of things, but it's with a positive energy for them, on their behalf. So by praying for them, you're already loving them in a way, if you're praying for your enemy. And also remember, prayer is not just talking to God. Prayer is also what? Listening. Listening. So also you're expecting God's leading and direction about how you might love that enemy, how you might love the people who are hateful. And let me say this, and I want to be clear, because I know I never heard it this way growing up. I thought love was just warm fuzzies, right? Love is just tenderness, right? Teddy bear kind of feelings. And imagining having that toward my enemy, that feels like a really, really, really tall order. But love in the biblical stories is not just warm fuzzies. Love is a choice. Love is wanting the good, the whole, the healing for other people. And that we are working and living in ways to bring that. So it's not warm fuzzies. It's a commitment. It's a choice to want what's good and whole and healing for other people. And Jesus is saying, that's what I'm calling you to do. When you have those enemies, when you have the people that hate you, respond to that with the energies of prayer, with the energies of listening. And again, you might be speaking truth to that power. you will also hold people accountable. It's not letting people walk all over you, but it is a love that's committed to the good. It's committed to wholeness and healing. And so once I realized I hated someone, I could now apply the teaching. And I was grumpy about it because I had to shift my energy and attention. Instead of sort of watching for that person to do something wrong so I could cheer on their failure, and not praying for them. And I also understand that as I prayed for them, it wasn't that they would miraculously become a different person. That prayer doesn't necessarily, I don't know what prayer always does for other people, but what I do know is prayer changes me. And what happened as I prayed for this person is I was able to let go of my energies of wanting harm for them. And I was focused, what I want, it's not my job and I probably won't have anything to do with it, but God, I'm praying for your healing and wholeness for this person. That this person maybe wouldn't do harm to other people like I experienced. And then there was a sense of peace in me. And it helped me make better decisions about making new friends. And I was also thinking this week, along these lines, in a church I was serving, the prayer part of the worship service was a lot like ours in our service, where there's an opportunity in silence to share your prayer requests, your joys or concerns silently or aloud. And in this one church, there was a person who started to pray, and the acoustics, I'll say, were a little better than they are in here. So a lot of times I know other people are praying, but we probably can't quite hear what they're saying. But this person, you could hear very clearly. This person, in the silence, you would hear, I pray for our president and our government. And I remember as I first started hearing that, and it was week after week, I was imagining there were some people like, yes, because they appreciated what the president and the government seemed to be doing. And there were other people like, oh, no, you don't. Now, I knew this person well who was praying it, and this person came and talked to me, how there had been some in the church who knew her well and said, I don't think you like this president. Why are you praying for this president? And she said, that's exactly why. I'm not praying for success of programs or possibilities, but I am praying that there would be healing and wholeness in the president and all of our elected leaders. And she said, and I know I will still, at times, I'll be protesting and I will sign petitions and I will do my part, that loving people and praying for them does not mean that you don't also hold them accountable. She said, but I'm praying for this president because this president feels like my enemy. And that's what Jesus calls me to do. And she said, before, I was just wanting this president to maybe be failed or destroyed. But she said, what occurred to me, and I think this is where Jesus is coming from, evil or badness, it's like whack-a-mole. You knock one down and another pops up. So wouldn't it be better if there could be transformation instead of destruction? And then she looked at me and she said, you know how we talk about in Bible study that it seems like Jesus knows what he's talking about? I'm thinking that right now. And I said, yeah, me too. Dr. King reminds us that darkness cannot cast out darkness. Only light can do that. That hate cannot cast out hate. Only love can do that. And Jesus is showing us this way to love. Let us follow. Come and see. Amen.